Welcome back, everybody. John, our resident chair, has nipped out for 5 minutes, but I want to keep the thing moving because we're a little bit behind schedule. Josiah Meldrum is our next speaker, and Josiah is the founder of Hodmy Dodds in the UK, which is about protein crops. I know Josiah has a much better description and introduction, so I'm not going to waste time talking about it. I'm going to let him tell you the real deal. So, hello, Josiah.
And thanks for inviting me over, and I'm sorry that I'm not actually there in person, but it sounds like you're having a lot of fun, and you've got a great program. So I was going to start just by going through a little slide presentation just to talk a little bit about what Hodmy Dodds is and what we do, and I thought that might be quite useful to set some context, because I'd like afterwards to have a little chat about, whether the crops that we're interested in and that we work with can be grown in Ireland. And I think the answer is absolutely, they certainly can be. But the question is whether you can find a market for them that reflects the cost of production and the process of developing those crops for your own farms and farm systems. So I'll do a little bit of an introduction about Hodmy Dodds and about myself, and then we can perhaps break into that more conversational section. So I'm just going to share my screen. And get to the beginning. Sorry about that. A sneak preview. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about our realization that underutilized, as you might describe them, crops that could and were already being grown in the UK really needed to find a market in order to create more sustainable crop rotations, more resilient economic models for farms, and better health for consumers. And Nick Saltmarsh, William Hudson and I began working on a project in the mid-2000s, really, looking at whether a city, our regional city, which is Norwich in East Anglia, could feed itself from its hinterland. And we looked at all sorts of different factors. We looked at horticultural production, and like a lot of cities in sort of Western Europe, there would once have been a ring of market gardens around the city, but that's completely disappeared. We looked at cereal processing and growing and baking and milling, and down by the river in the middle of Norwich, you can see the river in the bottom right of the screen near our logo. There would have been loads of mills, even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but that's all disappeared. So grain grown on the edge of the city no longer goes into the city for processing. It disappears off to plant bakeries and contract millers. We looked at livestock and mixed farming systems, and we wondered what the picture would be of this more resilient rotation and farming and food system. And the big missing part, we realized, was the nitrogen fixing crops, the leguminous crops. Even back then, it was pretty clear that we were in what we're now calling, I think, a climate and extinction crisis, an emergency even. Whereby, I don't need to go through these numbers, but, atmospheric carbon is at over 400 parts per million, highest it's been for 4 million years. Back at that time, the global temperature was between 2 and 4 degrees higher than it is now. On the sort of habitat loss front, we've lost 180 million hectares of forest in the last 30 odd years. And we tend to think of that as being tropical forests, but of course it's not. It's temperate, it's boreal forests, it's all over the world. So there is this real drive to change our diets and to change the way we're producing food in order to have less impact, to use less synthetic nitrogen, for example, which has a big carbon impact. Between, around 2% of anthropogenic global carbon emissions come directly from the production of nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process. And land use change, that deforestation in order to grow feed for livestock, for example, is a significant problem. So finding ways in which we can resolve those issues was what was motivating us. And we realized that we needed to be growing more nitrogen fixing crops, but also plant-based proteins, because of this drive to reduce meat consumption, not to stop eating meat, but to eat less of it and make better choices about where that meat was to come from. And we realized that the bean that we eat in the UK, and I'm sure the same is the case in Ireland, is this wonderful white bean in a red sauce. And we think of it as incredibly British, baked beans, beans on toast, tea when you come home from school. That's very much the image that one has of it over here. And yet all the ingredients are imported. The beans are grown in the Great Lakes area of North America. and the source is made up of imported tomatoes, fairly obviously. And per capita, the UK, Britain, is one of the lowest consumers of beans and pulses in the world, with the exception of baked beans, and we are global leaders in baked bean consumption. So we realized we had this challenge. We had to find, not only did we have to introduce these crops into a rotation, but we had to encourage people to eat them. And more to the point, we thought, encourage farmers to grow crops that they were not currently growing and which are incredibly tricky. So we began speaking to farmers about this. And I should be clear that although William has a farming background, Nick and I don't. So we were possibly quite naive about some of the questions we were asking, like, can you grow chickpeas in Norfolk? And at the time, everyone said no. We quickly realized that, of course, there are lots of pulses grown, and they're grown for animal feed, and they're grown because they're an important part of a rotation as a break crop and also for nitrogen fixation. But they're not really grown for human consumption. And we began talking to farmers about these beans, which are field beans, fava beans, tick beans. They grow brilliantly here. They've been here since the Iron Age, came over with the first settled farmers in the late Neolithic, and they were for a long, long time an important store of winter protein for human consumption. But we got rich 400 years ago, roughly. We developed our colonies. We found New World beans, and if you needed to eat these Old World beans through the winter, you were stigmatized as poor. If you couldn't afford meat, then something had gone wrong, and they just fell out of favor completely. But there remains this quite powerful export market that's developed over the last 20 or 30 years into North Africa and the Middle East for human consumption beans, where the fava bean is used to make dishes like ful madames and falafel called tameya in Egypt, and about 200,000 tons annually from the UK is exported for that market. The rest tends to go to animal feed. Fish food is a particularly growing area, but also into pigs, poultry, and some ruminants too. And just to be clear, I don't know which way around you see the slides, but on the one side, we've got the New World beans, the Phaseolus type beans. So you can see climbing beans, you can see French beans, and all their diversity, although they're all the same species. And on the other side, we've got the field bean or fava bean, and that's specifically what we're talking about. If we eat them green, we think of them as broad beans. And that's what they look like when they're harvested. You're an audience that will be familiar with this, but a lot of audiences don't realize that these beans are actually harvested dry in the field. And of course, that's the case with all pulse crops. They are the mature seeds of leguminous plants, and that maturation happens in the field, and then they're combined at the end of the season. There they are. And we began just by packing up beans that would have been exported. So whole fava beans and the split fava beans. The whole are used to make the ful madames, the bean stew, which is used to break fast during Ramadan and for breakfast. And the split beans are used to make falafel and hummus and things like that. And we thought, well, this is amazing. These are amazing crops. We've packed them beautifully. Everyone's going to agree with us that they need to be eating them. And it'll be such a straightforward thing. This is back in 2012. What we quickly realized is that is not how the food industry works. Most new products that are introduced are actually slight modifications of pre-existing products. Usually it's a twist on the branding or the presentation. Introducing something that people are completely unfamiliar with involves a lot more work, and it essentially involves a process of storytelling and creating new narratives around unfamiliar foods. And in the UK, over the last, well, really since the 90s, we've become a lot more adventurous in our food culture. We've become a lot more interested in foods from other parts of the world and other cultural traditions, so North African cuisine in particular, the Middle Eastern cuisine. So there was a small opening for us to use traditional recipes to get these beans out there, but we really, really struggled. And one of the things that we struggled with was we felt it was important to get them into recipe books, for example, to find food writers like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who's a big supporter of ours, and get them into their books. And they would be keen, and then their editorial team would say, actually, I don't think we can include those because they're not easy to find on the shelves. And of course, the big catch-22 there is that unless people are asking for them, they're not going to appear on the shelves. So we did an awful lot of work, probably 3 years' work, really solidly, just communicating with food writers, with bloggers, with journalists, and trying to create a narrative around this bean, this crop that could be grown in the UK, was delicious, and that we could be eating a lot more of and growing a lot more of. We quickly branched into other pulses, again, traditionally grown in the UK. So things like marrowfat peas, whole blues or whole greens, and yellow peas, but also the carlin pea, which is at the bottom of the picture there, the brown pea, which would have been eaten very widely up until the 15th, 16th century, but is now kind of the preserve of very traditional kind of food culture. So they're eaten on bonfire night in the north of England as a parched pea, where they're boiled and covered in vinegar and eaten as a sort of a street foodie snack. And they're eaten traditionally on Passion Sunday during Lent, called Care Sunday. We're not quite sure what the origins of that tradition are, but it is continued in some parts of the country. But they're actually a fantastic alternative to a chickpea and have a delicious chestnutty flavour. We began looking at other ways of processing them. So this is a very straightforward bean flour. It's just the split beans milled. We roasted them to bring additional flavour, but also to encourage people who maybe thought they didn't like beans, but who did like snacks, to eat them and to open up new markets. That doesn't look especially appealing, I appreciate, but it's actually a fermented fava bean, and we puree that ferment and make a miso paste or miso type paste, which can be used as an alternative to soya-based misos in cooking, or as a sort of Worcester sauce alternative as well. And this is the bit that I think is really interesting. Or in beginning the project, we were working with pulses that were already being grown for the commodity market and that were largely being exported for human consumption. By 2014, we'd grown to the point where we felt we could go to a farmer and ask them to grow specific varieties for them, for us, and to engage in longer term relationships where we would develop the pulse element of their rotation for a higher value market. And the first farmer we worked with was this chap here. He's called Mark Lee, and he's an organic farmer in Shropshire. And Mark got in touch with us and said, I've seen you're selling peas. I grow peas and they leave the farm in 28-ton trucks, and I never know what happens to them. I'd love them to be going into a human consumption market. And so we initially worked with him on 4 varieties, a yellow and blue pea, very straightforward varieties, marrowfat peas, and carlin peas. The marrowfats are very, very difficult, and the carlin peas are very, very difficult. So we cut out the carlin peas, and now he tends to grow either yellow or blues and the brown carlin peas. And what was really useful about that process is that the reason there was no organic human consumption pea production happening in the UK was simply because the Canadians have got really, really good at it. And they've got economies of scale and volume, and they're able to produce at fractionally below the cost of production for UK peas. And human consumption peas do require, and we can talk about this later, do require a lot more care than a feed grade pea. So there is a bit more cost associated with them. And so for a lot of farmers, trying to grow to a human consumption spec and then finding yourself undercut by imports just wasn't worthwhile. So the process with Mark was to really work out with him what those peas cost him to produce and what price we needed to pay to encourage him to want to grow them year on year, because we wanted a long-term relationship. And we also needed to work through with him what the post-harvest processing needed to be in order to ensure that we got a pea that would work in a packet and that people could cook at home. And that's been a 5, 6, 7 year process now. We've done a lot of different experiments with Mark, from different types of conveyor and ways of moving the peas after harvest to different processes in field. So the carlin peas that Mark is standing in there tend to fall over. I say tend to, they always fall over. And although they're beautiful during the growing season, they are nightmarish to harvest. So we've looked at various different intercropping models using things like triticale and other cereals, barley in particular, Mark, he doesn't anymore, unfortunately, but he did have a beef herd. And so the screenings that he would take out from the peas, or the cereal split, if he was doing an intercrop, had a very useful home on the farm. And then we've been looking at trialing other crops. So having realized that we could work out how to grow and market the traditional pulse crops in the UK, we then began working on other crops. And that included lentils, which we trialled at Wakelands Agroforestry. This is an early lentil trial when we thought it was a good idea to grow them with barley for support. And you can see the barley, but I don't think you can see the lentils. Tragically, I still have these lentils because we never managed to get the barley out. And it turns out they're a weed of lentils. So you live and learn. Going back one, quinoa, another protein crop, and so the protein crops are not necessarily just legumes. And I think it's important to think very broadly about that. A crop like quinoa has a perfect amino acid profile for human consumption. It has all those essential amino acids, the amino acids our body can't make and that we need to get from other places. So that's a fantastic crop to grow for that reason. And then cereals. Let's not forget that cereals do contain a lot of protein, and a naked barley like this one will be somewhere between 15 and 19% protein. So, protein crops do not necessarily have to be legumes. And then they can be brassicas. So this is camelina, which is an oil seed. And camelina has a sort of delicious nutty flavor and a high omega oil content. So nutritionally, it's extremely useful food crop. Crops like chia. I think I did see John Pawsey walking in front of the camera just before I started. And John has actually grown organic chia this year for the first time in the UK. And here are the lentils back up at a field scale. And we've been growing those since 2017. And I think broadly, to describe where we've got to, it's the realization that we did need to intervene in the pulse area of the rotation, but there are opportunities throughout a sustainable rotation to add value. And really the value adding is twofold. It's adding value agroecologically, what is the contribution that crop is making to your farm system and its sustainability and inputs that are required, but also what economic role is it playing. And traditionally, some of those break crops have been quite low value and they've been quite unloved and overlooked. And if we can shift the emphasis on those crops, they can become a really, really useful part of a farm business model. So I'll stop sharing there. Don't know what you can all see now. And I think what we've developed, we now work with about 25 farmers across the UK. So they're not all in East Anglia. A lot of them are in East Anglia, but they're everywhere from Cornwall all the way up to Scotland. And the system that we've developed reflects really that early work with Mark Lee. So it's a kind of relational network of supply rather than purely transactional. We want to be able to work with farmers that we work with longer term. We want to be able to affect change on their farms in a broad scale. And we're a small business. I'm not going to pretend we're a big business, but we are able to intervene in different parts of the rotation and help and support farmers as they broadly make a transition towards an agroecological production system. And not all the farmers we work with are organic by any means. So we work with quite a lot of organic farmers, but also we work with non-organic farmers who are maybe transitioning to organic or who are maybe beginning the process of implementing kind of regenerative techniques on their land. And I think the really interesting thing with that is that obviously there is a huge upsurging in interest in regenerative farming in the UK, but it doesn't really have a point of difference for the customer. And that makes it quite a challenge. And I think what we're attempting to do by telling stories that track directly back to the farm and adding that value is allowing farmers to sort of see the opportunity and the possibility and begin to make those broader changes. So that's us, and that's what we do. I'm going to just show you a little thing here, which I'll hold up. So things that we've done are, in part of that communication, is apart from having the website and things like that, is we've sent writers onto farms to tell the stories and help communicate what this process of change looks like, and what growing pulses as part of a relational network might be for them. And I think the broader questions that you will all have is, how do we do this? How do we make this happen? And I think in the UK, we're lucky in that we've got a lot of pre-existing infrastructure. So one of the things that we realized early on was that there was no point in Hodmedod as a business learning how to become a pulse processor and buying all the machinery and equipment to do that job. And we were very lucky in that there are actually quite a lot of businesses that specialize in doing that. So they're working for the feed sector, or they're working for human consumption export markets, but they do know what they're doing. And once we convince them to handle, less than 100 tons of any given crop, they have been incredibly useful in sharing their knowledge and helping us to understand how to handle, process these crops, how they should be presented ex-farm, ready for cleaning, what we could do pre-farm, and really simple things like drying. Most farmers that we work with don't necessarily have access to a drying floor, so they'll have a little opica, those little pepper pot dryers. You put your peas into that with an auger system and they'll all split and they'll be no good to anyone. So things like that seem really obvious, but it did take us a while to learn. So yeah, and I think the challenge for farmers in the audience and in Ireland who are thinking along these lines, I think there is a really big opportunity, is how are you not only going to grow those crops, but how are you going to take them to what is a really, really ready market? There's a big shift towards plant-based eating, not really veganism. That's still a relatively tiny part of the population, but this sort of flexitarian model where people are consuming less meat, and whole pulses and whole grains as well. That is the best way to consume them, not broken up into fractions of protein and carbohydrate and reconstituted into burgers and sausages and things. The best way to eat them is in their whole state, one way or another. And that really gives a fantastic opportunity to ex-farm businesses. So yeah, I think it'd be interesting to know, Sean, from your perspective, where things are at in Ireland on this front, whether what are the challenges that you face?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Josiah. I kicked Sean out of the chair, so I'm back. Anyway,
yes.
had to go and plug in the electric car, so it had to be done just over the bridge. Anyway, that was great, and we have a couple of questions in. I think the first one is really spot on, and I think it's probably in everybody's mind in the room. How well would these grow in wetter climates, aka our maritime climate here?
Yeah, so it's we always say most things are relatively easy to grow. It's just really, really difficult to harvest them. And so fava beans, field beans, particularly the tick variety, the smaller seeded ones, which we've actually, Maris bead is the variety we tend to use now, because it cooks and eats very well. They're really well adapted to a Northern European climate, and they're relatively straightforward to grow. The two big issues are bruchid damage. I don't know if you have a problem with bruchid, a small beetle that eats into the beans, and being able to harvest them dry, because again, harvesting them wet is a challenge. Likewise, peas. So conventional growers in the UK, I mean, we work with a lot of organic growers, so we've already sort of addressed some of these, but conventional growers in the UK are struggling because they're no longer able to use the desiccants that they were using in order that they could harvest those crops when they felt they were ready and the weather was right. The organic farmers have always had that challenge. They've always had to wait for even maturity. And I think all of that, that's clearly possible. And I know that farmers in wetter parts of the UK are seriously considering looking at swathing, for example, again, a practice that really hasn't been used for decades, frankly. But those approaches did work, and there's no reason why they shouldn't work again.
Okay. And another question, this is from Marie Comerford. She wants to know, do you connect producers and mills, and do you encounter major bureaucracy with food standards, etc.? And if I could put a rider on that, you said I think you spent, was it 3 years, kind of overcoming the inertia and resistance. Not many people in the business would have that, either resources or persistence to do that. So maybe you might talk about those two things, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I think in terms of our persistence, because we had been working for this NGO, East Anglia Food Link, while we developed the project, and we had other work going on at the same time. I think it's really important to say that. And for those first 3 years, until we got a premises of our own in 2014, Hodmedod was sort of a part-time, working out the logistics. How is this going to work? Building relationships. So we were persistent, and it also wasn't all we were doing. So I think that's really important to say. Some of the barriers we faced were that fairly obviously we wanted segregated batches that we could identify straight back to farm and potentially to field. We wanted varieties that weren't in the commodity markets, and so we did have to do quite a lot of work to convince the processors who clean and split and do various other things to take small batches. And I think we had success there because a lot of those bigger processors recognized that there was no UK human consumption market, but they also saw that there really ought to be. And that if they got in at the bottom with us, we'd be their useful idiots developing this market. And so I think you need to find the right person in one of those businesses. Milling itself is much more straightforward because mills can handle smaller batches, tend to handle smaller batches. So we've had less problem on that front. And in fact, we've now bought our own mill, so we are doing our own milling.
I thought it was very interesting as well, your observation about with your supplier to actually come to a longer-term arrangement where he's given security. We see this in Ireland for so many people in horticulture, where they're at the mercy of the Tesco's and the big buyers, and basically they're almost planting prospectively, and they're given these very short-term contracts, and which eventually I think people just get discouraged and leave. So I assume your model is sustainable in the business sense of the word, not just for you but also for your suppliers.
That's definitely what it's all about. And we buy from 5 odd farms. They probably represent in total, some of them are quite big, but some of them are tiny, somewhere between 16 and 20,000 hectares of land. We're probably only buying from 500 or 600 hectares of land, but we can, by adding value, we can form an important part of a whole. If you know that P element of your rotation is going to be worth a bit more than it might be as a feed crop, then it does incentivize you to do things slightly differently. Okay.
John or Sean, would either of you like to jump in?
Just on that last point, Joshua, an excellent presentation, by the way, really enjoyed that. Outside of a value-added break in the rotation on some of these farms, which are 25 farmers, what's the feedback in general from them? Are they happy enough to proceed, to continue doing it? Have they increased acreage, for example, in terms of growing for you and that?
Yeah, so we've been growing quite quickly, and we continue to do so. And it has made it easier. The challenge is always that volume is much. When we're trialing a new crop, for example, or a new variety, it makes no sense to do less than sort of 5 or 6 acres, because otherwise it's not enough to give it attention to detail on a large farm, and it becomes a fiddle to move and to dry and all of those kind of things, and the costs add up. So we're always keen to kind of move to that point where we're handling reasonable quantities and areas, and it's really only in the last 2 or 3 years that we've been able to significantly do that. So Mark, the first farm you looked at, we might be now buying product from 30 or 40 hectares a year, which has gone up from 5 or 10. So it's becoming increasingly an interesting and significant part of his farm.
Great.
Now I guess the other thing I would say, in sort of the spirit of diversity and diverse sort of livelihood strategies, is that we wouldn't want to be a farm's only customer. That's where you get into trouble,
Yeah. Yeah.
We have just one from the floor now, please.
Hi, Josiah. This is John Brennan here. And,
Hi, John.
The last time we had a pint, we were all in the EU, so things have changed a little bit. But just to say that Josiah has a long history of working with Leitrim Organic Farmers. He was involved in cooperative projects in the past, and glad that we kept the links. Just a couple of questions for you. The first one is, 1 or 2 people have grown camelina here in Ireland. In one case, the camelina was grown as a kind of an understory to a malting barley crop. And I just wonder, number one, is there a good market for that, and what would the kind of ideal growing conditions be? And secondly, I think in another conversation we had, you talked about an opportunity here for Irish pea growers because of a particular pest that you had in the UK. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
So camelina is really, it's really interesting, and it's often used as an intercrop. It's a brassica, so it has that allelopathic kind of soil root interaction. So it works quite nicely with lentils, and it will also hold them up a little bit without competing with them overly. I've not tried it, or we've not tried it, grown as an understory in a cereal. So I'm not sure how that might work. My concern would be that grown in that way, you might end up holding too much moisture into the understory, and it would be quite difficult to harvest. The advantage with lentils is that it's an overstory in that case, and the seed pods, which form at the top of the plant, can dry more readily and can be harvested either before the lentils or at the same time. So the issue with beans is beans rather than peas, and it's the bruchid beetle. And if I don't know, my understanding is you don't have quite such big issues with it over there as we have over here. It's a pest of fava beans in particular that overwinters in headlands, emerges in June to go on a mating flight, lays its eggs on the pods, and then the grubs eat their way into the beans where they live out the rest of their lives. And that causes a lot of damage, cosmetic damage to the beans, and leaves beetles in them, which our customers, we've not yet managed to encourage them that beetles are an important protein source.
Okay. Now, Sean, did you want to jump in just to finish up?
Yeah, thanks, Josiah. It's been really interesting. I wanted to ask you maybe on the bigger picture thing. Actually, Johnny Green mentioned it and we discussed it throughout the week about the whole idea of nutrient density, and that as we sell, farmers don't necessarily get the benefit even if they do it, particularly if they're in a regenerative model as opposed to an organic system. But with small companies like yours, are you kind of paying a premium to the non-organic guys as well because they're in that regenerative or agroecology position?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. Yeah. We need to demonstrate that change is worthwhile, and the only way you can do that is by offering an incentive. And the incentive is twofold. It is economic, but it's also being part of a network of farmers who are kind of mutually supporting each other and sharing ideas. We took our farmer group, or the bulk of them, over to Sweden to see a very similar farmer network over there, and we do bits and pieces like that, which I think is all part of creating a community around growing.
Sorry, Sean, go ahead. Yep.
You have 25 farmers, but the product is all being packed outside Hodmy Dodds. How do you manage that quality? One farmer could be better than the other with the same crop. Is that a difficulty or?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. So there is a process of decommodification in what we're doing. So we're not necessarily expecting uniformity in all those crops. Often there's only one or two farmers growing any given thing for us in any given year. But we do have variability between years as well. So it is difficult because we identify every farmer on the packet of the product, and because we recognise that things that are otherwise the same might actually be quite different. We get our customers expressing a preference for a particular farm. So lentils, for example, we grow the same variety on 5 farms. Amazingly, they do taste distinctly different, and we'll have chefs that will say, I particularly want the ones from Farmer X.
It's funny you should say that. I see in some co-ops and some meat products have when you go to the supermarket, they have the picture of the farmer on the shelf, but I very much doubt it's the same farmers producing all those steaks, or the same cows, or same farmers producing all that milk for that 6 months of the year or whatever. So, but you you actually take it down to that level where if the farmer's photograph is on that pack, you're guaranteed it's on the farmer's field.
Yeah. We wouldn't terrify our farmers by putting their photo on the pack, but we put their name on it.
Okay.
To be fair, not all of them want that because they don't want to be easily identified. They don't want the kind of attention, but those that do, we put their name on the pack.
Terrific.
Thanks.
Okay, listen, that's brilliant. Thanks again, Josiah. And we're now going to take a 2-minute break, and we will be back with Mike Harrington in just a moment.